Calvin Reese was 37 years old the afternoon his wife sat across from her divorce attorney, slid a yellow legal pad across the desk, and said, "He has nothing. A truck, some tools, and maybe 40,000 in a savings account if we're being generous." She said it with the quiet satisfaction of someone reading a hand they were certain of. Her attorney, a man named Gerald Oates with 22 years of family law behind him and a reputation in Memphis for knowing exactly how much a person was worth, before they sat down, nodded and made a note. Then, because it was his practice, he excused himself to run the name. He was gone 11 minutes. When he came back, he did not sit down. He stood in the doorway of his own conference room and looked at Simone in a way she would later describe to her sister as the look a doctor gives you right before everything changes. He said quietly, "I need you to reconsider your assumptions about your husband." She laughed. She thought he was being dramatic. He was not being dramatic. He picked up his phone and called Calvin Reese directly, not through counsel, not through the standard channels. Because in 22 years of practice, Gerald Oates had learned that there were moments when the professional thing and the honest thing were the same thing, and this was one of them. What Calvin said on that call, what Gerald had found when he ran the name, what Simone had spent 4 years standing beside without ever seeing, that is the story. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The Memphis morning came in low and gray, the kind of sky that pressed itself against the rooftops and settled in for the day without apology. Calvin Reese was already up. He was always already up. He had been that way since childhood. His grandmother Ida would find him at the kitchen table before 6, drawing floor plans on the backs of grocery receipts. She used to say, "Boy, what are you always planning?" And he would show her the sketches, rooms, staircases, load-bearing walls, and she would look at them with an expression that was equal parts pride and mild bewilderment, because she had grown up in a house where the ceiling leaked, and here was her grandson, designing buildings before the coffee was hot. Ida Reese had died 3 years ago, and Calvin still felt the specific weight of her absence on quiet mornings. He had bought her a house, a proper one, brick with a porch she could sit on, and a garden he'd had a landscaper lay out because he knew she would want one even though she never asked for anything. She had lived in it for 4 years and died in her own bed in her own room. Calvin considered that one of the better things he had ever managed to arrange in his life. He stood now in the kitchen of the house he shared with Simone, drinking coffee from a plain white mug, looking at the backyard through the window above the sink. He had built the pergola himself 2 summers ago, pressure-treated posts and cedar slats, a project he'd done on weekends over 6 weeks. Simone had photographed it for her social accounts and received 11,000 likes and had not mentioned that Calvin built it. That was fine. He had not built it for the likes. Simone. He let himself think about her the way he did most mornings now, carefully. The way you think about something that has started to hurt in a way that is not yet fully clear. They had been married 4 years, and something had shifted 18 months ago. Some weight distributed, some warmth relocated. She was often out in the evenings at industry events, she said, at dinners with colleagues from her public relations firm. He had believed her because he did not have a specific reason not to. Because he was a man who extended good faith until the evidence argued otherwise. He had met her at a gala for a community development nonprofit, a benefit for affordable housing in South Memphis, organization he supported in ways that appeared on no guest list and no donor wall. She was there for a client. She was stunning and sharp, and had opinions about zoning law that surprised him enough that he asked to continue the conversation over dinner. For 2 years she had been the most interesting person in any room he entered. He had loved her specifically and deliberately, the way he loved things he chose to build. His other phone, a secondary line registered to one of his holding companies, used for business communications, he preferred to keep separate from his personal life. sat charging onto the kitchen counter beside his keys. It had been there every morning. Simone had never once asked whose number that was. He had a meeting at 9 with his project manager on a warehouse conversion in South Memphis. He rinsed his mug, set it in the rack, was reaching for his jacket when his personal phone buzzed with a number he did not recognize. Memphis area code. He almost let it go to voicemail. He answered on the 4th ring. "Mr. Reese," the voice said. "My name is Gerald Oates. I believe you know why I'm calling." Calvin was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think I do." "I would appreciate an hour of your time," Gerald said. "And I would appreciate it if you'd come to my office rather than having your counsel reach mine." "What I have to say would be better," said person to person. Calvin set his jacket back down. He said 2 o'clock. He drove to the warehouse meeting. He ran the project review with the same focus he always brought. He did not mention the call. He drove back across the river with the city spread out behind him and thought, with the calm of a man who had been waiting for a particular thing to arrive, that it had finally arrived. He had not set out to be invisible about it. It had simply happened that way, incrementally, the way most things Calvin Reese built began, with a single decision, a single pour, one beam set level and plumb, and then another. He had started his first LLC at 24, a one-man construction outfit that took small residential remodel jobs and turned them carefully and never lost money. By 27, he had 3 crews. By 30, he had absorbed 2 smaller contractors and had his name on 6 commercial projects, the Memphis metro area. He did not talk about this at dinner parties. He drove a 5-year-old Ram 1500 because it was useful and honest, and he did not see the point of a car that did nothing but tell people how much. His accountant, a man named Dennis who had been with him since the beginning, had once suggested Calvin consider a more visible profile. Calvin had looked at him and said, "Visible to who? I'm not selling anything." Dennis had shrugged and gone back to his spreadsheets. The portfolio, by the time Simone's attorney ran his name, included 14 properties across Shelby County, 2 commercial developments in Nashville, a minority interest in a logistics company outside of Little Rock, trust his grandmother had never lived to see finalized, but that bore her name, the Ida Francis Reese Trust, and funded housing support for low-income seniors in Memphis. The total value, conservatively estimated, was $4.1 million. His personal checking account, the only one Simone had ever been aware of, had $43,000 in it. She was not wrong about the $40,000. She was simply looking at one room of a very large house. His building permit for that warehouse project in South Memphis was pulled under a company, name she had seen on his truck decals for 3 years and never once searched. He had sometimes wondered if she would. She never had. He arrived at Gerald Oates's office at 1:58 and was shown directly in. The conference room had a view of the river, brown and wide in the October light. Gerald was standing when Calvin entered, which he took as a mark of respect. He accepted the handshake and sat down and waited. Gerald sat across from him. He set a single piece of paper on the table and turned it so Calvin could read it. It was a summary printout. Business registrations, property records, the trust. 1 page, the kind of thing that took 11 minutes to compile if you knew what you were looking for. "Your wife told me this morning that you were essentially without significant assets," Gerald said. "She was confident." "She would be," Calvin said. "She is my client, and I owe her zealous representation. I also cannot participate in proceedings I believe to be predicated on a material misrepresentation of assets by either party." He paused. "I called you because I am going to advise her to retain new counsel. I can no longer represent her in this matter without a conflict I am not comfortable with." Calvin looked at the paper. "It's an unusual thing to do." "I have been doing this a long time," Gerald said. "When I see a filing that is built on a false foundation, I would rather stop the work than watch the building collapse on people who are standing inside it." He looked at Calvin steadily. "Including her." Calvin nodded slowly. He thought about his grandmother, Ida, who had raised him on a single principle that she phrased differently depending on the occasion, but that always meant the same thing: build honest or don't build at all. What did she say when you told her? Calvin asked. Gerald's expression was measured. She didn't believe me. She asked me to show her the documents. He paused. Then she asked me to call you. Calvin looked out at the river. I know, he said. He had already, by that afternoon, retained his own counsel, a woman named Lenora Cross, who practiced out of a quiet office in East Memphis and had handled asset protection work for Calvin's holding company for 3 years. She had received his call that morning, before the 9 o'clock meeting, before the river crossing, before the 2 o'clock appointment. She had said 3 words when he explained the situation. I've been ready. He left Gerald's office at 2:45 and sat in his truck for a long moment, engine off. He thought about the pergola in the backyard, the cedar slats he had measured and cut and fitted by hand. He thought about what it meant to build something for someone who was looking at a camera. The whole time, he put the truck in gear. He had work to do. Lenora Cross did not look like what people expected when they expected a lawyer. She was 61, wore her silver hair short, and spoke in the measured cadences of someone who had long ago stopped needing to perform competence for rooms that doubted her. Her office had one framed photograph, her and her mother, fishing, somewhere along the Wolf River, and no diplomas on the walls, because she had been at this long enough that the walls were just walls. She had reviewed every document Calvin brought her and added them to a folder she'd been building for 3 weeks, since Calvin had first called her, with a quiet, specific concern about the direction of his marriage, and asked her to begin organizing the premarital asset documentation. She had not been surprised by the call. She had prepared as if the answer was yes, because preparation was the work. The premarital assets are protected, she said, spreading the trust documents and the earliest LLC filings across her desk. These predate the marriage by 4 and 6 years, respectively. The Nashville properties are in the trust, the Shelby County holdings in the commercial LLC. None of that is in play. The joint account, Calvin said, $43,000. She is entitled to half of what is demonstrably marital, which means we are talking about joint deposits during the marriage, your regular transfers, her regular transfers in, any joint expenses. Lenora tapped the folder. What I want to understand is the movement out. She had been thorough. Over the previous 3 weeks, she had subpoenaed the joint account records going back to the beginning of the marriage. What they showed had a shape to it, a familiar one. Beginning 14 months ago, $2, Ciro had transferred out each month to an account Lenora had traced to a personal savings account in Simone's name. Not a joint account. Hers. $28,000 moved in slow, unremarkable increments during the same period that Simone had, based on cell tower records and calendar patterns Lenora had assembled, been spending considerable time with a man named Terrence Galt, a marketing consultant who drove a leased Porsche, and had filed for personal bankruptcy 14 months prior, the same month the transfers began. Calvin received this information the way he received most difficult structural facts. He read it, sat with it, filed it where it belonged. She was building a bridge, he said. She was building a bridge, Lenora agreed. To someone who needed her to bring the materials. Calvin's said nothing for a moment. Then, what do we file? We file a response to her petition that correctly identifies the full scope of your premarital assets. We counterclaim for the return of the $28,000 removed from the joint account. We include the bank records and the timeline. Lenora looked at him over her reading glasses. And we note, for the record, her attorney has withdrawn from her representation due to a conflict of interest. That will become part of the narrative of this proceeding. It will be useful to us. She closed the folder. One more thing, she said. 2 weeks from now, Profile is running in the Memphis Business Journal. The development project in South Memphis, the warehouse conversion. You were interviewed 3 months ago. Calvin looked up. They used a photograph, Lenora said. Your name is on the building permit. the grant announcement, and the story. Full name. When that runs, anyone who has ever spent 40 minutes wondering who Calvin Reese actually is will have their answer in newsprint. She paused. Including everyone who knows your wife. Calvin was quiet. I am not suggesting we time anything around the article, Lenora said carefully. I am simply noting that certain truths have their own schedules. That evening, Calvin drove home and grilled 2 pieces of salmon on the deck he had built, and set plates on the table beneath the pergola he had built, and Simone came home at 7 and ate dinner with him in the October air, and talked about a client campaign and asked about the warehouse project, and he answered her questions directly and warmly. And when she went inside, he sat in the chair under the cedar slats and listened to the neighborhood settle into its evening sounds and felt the particular quiet of a man who had nothing left to decide. Some things were built. Some things were finished. He was working on which was which. The mediation was held on the second Tuesday in November in a conference room at the offices of Simone's second attorney, a woman named Priya Shetty, who had taken the case on short notice and had, to her credit, done her homework. Calvin had seen this in her eyes when he walked in, the slight recalibration, the way her reading of the room shifted when she assessed him against whatever Simone had told her. Lenora was with him. Calvin carried a leather portfolio and set it on the table without opening it, and sat with his hands folded in a way that was perfectly relaxed and gave the impression of a man who had been in exactly this kind of room before, and found it manageable. Simone arrived 3 minutes late. She looked composed, carefully so. She did not meet his eyes immediately. When she did, Calvin held her gaze without expression, not coldly, just clearly, and she looked away first. Priya Shetty laid out Simone's position. The house, half the joint accounts, claim for spousal support on the basis of her reduced income trajectory, given the disruption of the marriage. She spoke well and precisely. She had built the strongest version of the case available to her with the facts Simone had provided. Lenora let her finish. Then she opened the portfolio. The first document, a certified summary of Calvin's premarital holdings organized by entity and dated. The Ida Francis Reese Trust, established at age 30. The first commercial LLC, registered when Calvin was 24. The Nashville properties. The Shelby County portfolio. Total premarital value $3.8 million, none of it marital. All of it documented with a precision that comes from 3 years of working with the same meticulous attorney. Priya Shetty read it. Her face did not change in the way that meant nothing had changed. It changed in the way that meant she was processing. Simone said, "Can't be right." Lenora did not acknowledge this. She placed the second document, the joint account transfers. 28 individual transactions, $2,000 each, 14 months of systematic movement into Simone's personal savings account. Timeline note that the transfers began the same month Terrence Golt filed for personal bankruptcy. Simone went very still. The third document, copy of the Memphis Business Journal profile which had run 4 days prior. Calvin on the construction site, hard hat, site plans under one arm. Ida Francis Reese Trust Community Housing Project in the background. The headline, South Memphis developer breaks ground on 80-unit senior housing complex, sat above a photograph that left very little ambiguous about who Calvin Reese actually was. "I've been getting calls," Simone said. It was not clear who she was speaking to. Lenora said, "Monsieur Shetty, I'd like to give you and your client a few minutes." She and Calvin stepped into the hallway. He leaned against the wall and looked at the ceiling. Lenora stood beside him with her arms folded, reading something on her phone, with the patience of someone who had been in a great many hallways. After 9 minutes, Priya Shetty opened the door and said, "We'd like to counter-propose." The proposed settlement that emerged over the following 2 hours bore little resemblance to what Simone had outlined to Gerald Oates on the yellow legal pad. She received half of the actual marital assets, the joint account balance and the equity in the house Calvin had suggested they put on the market. The spousal support claim was withdrawn. The $28 00 in undisclosed transfers was reconciled as a deduction from her share of the joint assets. She walked away with approximately $47.00 and no further claims against any entity associated with Calvin Reese. Priya Shetty gathered her documents with the quiet efficiency of a professional absorbing a result she had anticipated once the real facts were on the table. Simone stood and looked at Calvin across the conference table. He thought she might say something. She opened her mouth and then did not. "I want you to know I don't have any bitterness towards you," Calvin said. He meant it. He was a man who had learned from his grandmother that bitterness required ongoing emotional investment in people who no longer deserved it. He was particular about where he put his energy. "I hope you find something real." He picked up his portfolio and walked out. The hallway was long and lit with pale November light, and his footsteps were quiet on the carpet, the same purposeful quiet that had preceded every project he had ever started, every foundation he had ever poured, every wall he had ever raised from grade. He held the door open for a woman coming in from the street. He stepped into the cold and went home. 14 months had passed since that November like water through a sight drain. Quickly and without ceremony, leaving the ground underneath changed and ready. Calvin had finished the warehouse conversion in February and broken ground on the Ida Francis Reese senior housing complex in April. The complex had its own website now, its own donor page, its own waiting list. Dennis had suggested, Calvin had agreed, that the time for a slightly higher professional profile had probably arrived. Not for vanity, but because the work was too important to remain anonymous, and invisible money was harder to raise than visible money. So Calvin had done 2 interviews and attended 3 galas, and found the experience approximately as interesting as he had expected, which was not very, but the housing units were going up, and that was the point. He had sold the house in Collierville and was living in a converted loft in the South Main Arts District, a space he had designed himself from rough shell, concrete floors, steel windows. Kitchen built around a 12-foot island of reclaimed oak from a gym floor he had salvaged in Mississippi. Grandmother's photograph sat on the mantel above a fireplace he had tiled by hand over a long weekend in March. The neighbors knew him as the quiet man who came and went on a bicycle and always held the elevator. Renata had come with the second interview. She was a features editor at the Journal, not the reporter who had written the profile, but the editor who had approved it. And she had reached out after the complex broke ground to ask if Calvin would consider a longer piece on the trust's history. They had coffee. They had dinner. She was a woman who listened the way good editors listen, completely, with the particular attention of someone who knew that what a person did not say was often more structural than what they did. She asked him once, over dinner at a place in Cooper Young, why he had kept everything so quiet for so long. And he had said, "I was building. I didn't need an audience for that." She had looked at him for a long moment and said, "Fair," and he had decided, sometime around the walk back to the car, that he liked her specifically. He heard about Simone the way you heard about weather systems that had already moved through, obliquely, without urgency. Mutual acquaintance mentioned she had left the PR firm, some professional friction. The details were vague. Terrence Golt, whose bankruptcy had been finalized in March, had relocated to Atlanta. Her social accounts had gone quiet, then private, then apparently inactive. Her sister had called Calvin once in the spring to say she was sorry for the way things had gone. He had told her there was nothing to be sorry for and meant it. He stood now on the loft's rooftop terrace on a December evening, coffee in hand. The city spread out below him in its specific arrangement of lights and distances, the river black and certain at the edge of it all. Renata was inside finishing a call. He could see her through the glass, animated, laughing at something on the phone. His grandmother had once told him, on a morning when he was drawing floor plans on the back of a grocery receipt, that the difference between a plan and a building was the work in between. He had spent his whole adult life in that space, between what could be imagined and what could be made to stand. He had found it to be the most honest place he had ever occupied. He was solvent, he was clear. He was, for the first time in several years, entirely unbothered. He was free. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.